Prof. Zaman, do we have international participant?
Yes.
Do we have international participant?
Indonesia tadi.
Ini sekretariat lah. Saya dah hebahkan ke sana. Beyond our shores.
No international participant, then we can speak Malay and English yang pun ada lah.
Yeah.
Indonesia macam mana?
Prof Ghairu banyak peminat kat Indonesia tu. So, international lah tu.
Yeah.
Kita dah start admit Prof.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Farah ada enable screen sharing tak?
Kejap. Saya cuba kejap ni.
Prof Chin, how are you, Prof Chin?
Yeah, I'm doing fine. Prof, Roslyn.
Hi. Morning. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing fine. Thank you. Prof Kamal.
Where are you? In Penang?
Home.
Okay.
Bangkit pin. Sekejap. Let's share content.
Berapa orang di YouTube?
YouTube jap. Saya tak sempat nak tengok lagi. Jadi cloud, share nothing something. Scan audio. Kita tengah masukkan peserta sekejap. Prof Jomo tadi, Prof dah boleh share screen tadi. Tadi Prof dah share screen tadi. Nanti Prof share je. Boleh tak?
Saya cuba tapi menurut ini tak boleh.
Oh, tak boleh. Cuba Prof minta, dia ada minta request tak?
Dia kata host disable participant screen sharing.
Boleh ke?
Possible tak apa tu Prof Jomo hantar pada Naimah yang buka kan ke macam mana? Are you okay,
Yeah.
Prof Jomo?
Ya.
And I think the people, the participants from YouTube are waiting for the link as well.
Kita start dulu lah Prof. Boleh?
Okay, alright, boleh.
Saya record.
Naimah.
Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and very good morning. Welcome everyone to this APM fellow lecture series. On behalf of APM, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you for taking the time to attend this lecture series. So we have an exciting panels of speakers lined up for you today, and we hope that you will find their presentation and discussions informative and engaging. So before we begin, I would like to take a few moments to explain the rule for today's lecture. The first one, please make sure that your cell phones are on silent or switch off so we don't disturb the speakers and other attendees. So we encourage all the participants to ask questions in the chat box, and I will deliver the question to the moderator, and the moderator will pass the question to the speaker or the discussant. And please make sure you stay for the duration of the seminar, as it will provide a holistic understanding about the topic. Okay, so without further ado, I pass the session to Prof. Roslyn. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Puan Naimah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Prof. Jamal, I would like to invite you to give the introduction, to give the welcoming remarks, and at the same time to introduce Prof. Jomo by reading his CV. Over to you, Prof. Jamal.
Thank you, Prof. Rosalind, our moderator for today's session. Assalamualaikum, salam sejahtera, and very good morning, everyone. I'm Jamal Usman, President of Academy Professor Malaysia. Warmest welcome to all of you who are present in this session, either on our Zoom or YouTube platforms. My utmost appreciation to all esteemed participants, fellows and members of Academy Professor Malaysia, fellow academicians, policymakers and government officials, students, and members of the public at large. Thank you very much for giving us your valuable time to be with us in this APM Fellow Lecture Series. A very special thanks to our speaker, Emeritus Professor Dr. Jamal Kwame Sundaram, Honorary Fellow of Academy Professor Malaysia, our moderator, Professor Dr. Roslyn Muhammad Yusof, APM Fellow and Professor of University Utara Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, and our two discussants. First, Professor Dr. Ahsan Ali Gholam Hassan from University of Technology in Malaysia. He is Professor of Economics and Planning. And our second discussant is Professor Dr. Ghairu Zazmi bin Matgani, Dean of Kuliah of Economics and Management Sciences at the International Islamic University in Malaysia, Gombak campus. Certainly without any one of you, this lecture series would not take off well. I must say that this APM lecture series is a kind of our signature academic activity. And our other activities include roundtable discussions, conferences, our other activities include roundtable discussions, conferences, webinars, and specialized forums. This particular APM Fellow Lecture Series is designed to honor our honorary fellows as well as APM fellows who have achieved excellence at both national and international levels, and also have made meaningful contributions to their respective fields of knowledge and to society at large throughout their long career path. This lecture series would serve as an academic platform for our fellows to deliberate on various strategic policy concerns designed to benefit our stakeholders, who are largely our public policymakers, and also to our broader community. Currently, Academy Professor Malaysia has 9 honorary fellows, with Emeritus Professor Jomo Kwame Sunram being one of our earliest to be on the list. For your information, honorary fellows of the Academy of Professors Malaysia are individuals who have made significant contributions to the academic community and are further deemed committed to contribute their expertise to Academy Professor Malaysia. And their selections are evaluated and appointed by our Academy Professor Malaysia Council. Respected audience members, why the topic of this particular lecture today is significant. While the general public, I imagine, is undoubtedly anxious about the implication of the much talk about imminent fuel subsidy removals, and I believe many of you are also expecting such expositions by Prof. Jamal. However, without disregarding the relevance and importance of fuel subsidy reforms, today's lecture will cover the broader issue of our fiscal resiliency. And I believe Prof. Jamal will delve on various policy options that our government has at hand to resolve the issue, including on how best to juggle between the political interest to maintain the so-called populist policy and the economic needs for hard fiscal policy reforms. So we can expect Prof. Jamal's deliberation not to be just about fuel subsidy removals, its mechanism and or potential ramification, but it's going to be a lot broader than just fuel subsidy removals. On our speaker today, Professor Emeritus Dr. Jomo Kwame Sunram, I think he does not need any kind of introduction. He has long, I guess, been a household name, like a famous artist perhaps, particularly in the area of political economic analysis of Malaysian socioeconomic policies. But anyway, please allow me to highlight some of his distinguished achievements. He served as an Assistant Secretary General at the United Nations from 2005 to 2015 and was the Honorary Research Coordinator for the G24 Intergovernmental Group on International Monetary Affairs and Development from 2006 to 2012. He held the Tun Hussein On Chair at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, ISIS Malaysia, from 2016 to 2017, and currently he is Senior Advisor at the Khazanah Research Institute. I must say, APM is very honored and very fortunate to have Prof. Jomo as our distinguished honorary fellow of the APM, of the Academy of Professors Malaysia, since its inception in 2019. So it has been like 5 years already. I trust all of you will be enlightened by Prof. Jomo on a very timely topic of his own choice. I wish and I hope all of you would have a productive, wonderful, and thought-provoking session with Prof. Jamal. And to the esteemed speaker, Prof. Jamal, to the moderator, Prof. Rosalind, and to the two discussants, I wish you good luck on your deliberations. Thank you very much. And I will now return the mic to the moderator.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. President, Professor Emeritus Dr. Jamal Osman. Let us now start the session. Yang berbahagia, our honorable speaker for today, Emeritus Professor Dr. Jomo K. Sunram, the Honorary Fellow of Academy Professor Malaysia. Yang berbahagia, Emeritus Professor Dr. Jamal Osman, President of Academy Professor Malaysia. Our distinguished discussants today, Yang Berusaha Professor Dr. Ahsan Ali Ghulam Ahsan, and Yang Berusaha Professor Dr. Garuzazmi Madgani, distinguished guests, fellow professors and academics, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and a very good morning. My name is Rosalind Muhammad Yusof. I am now the Professor of Financial Economics from University Utara Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur. It is indeed an honor to be the moderator for this session in the presence of distinguished guests, renowned scholars, and fellow academics. Before I start, let me just share the format of today's event, which comprises of 3 subsessions. The first session will be the lecture by Yang Berbahagia Emeritus Professor Dr. Jomo K. Sundram. Second will be presentations by both discussants. And the third will be Q&A, an interactive session between the participants, Yang Berbahagia Emeritus Professor Dr. Jomo, and distinguished discussants. Distinguished guests, fellow professors, academics, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you all once again to our session, Fiscal Policy Reforms Malaysia Needs. We are honored to have a distinguished panel of experts who will share their knowledge and perspectives on this critical topic. Fiscal policy, which encompasses government spending and taxation decisions, plays a vital role in shaping a country's economic landscape. In Malaysia, effective fiscal policy reforms are essential for ensuring sustainable economic growth, reducing fiscal deficits, and addressing socio-economic disparities. Addressing these issues requires a multifaceted approach that includes both revenue-enhancing and expenditure-reducing measures. Our speakers today will discuss various aspects of these reforms, such as tax policy adjustments, public spending efficiency, and strategies for long-term sustainability. As we delved into the complexities of fiscal policy and its implications for Malaysia's future, I hope you find this session both enlightening and thought-provoking. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, may I now invite Yang Berbahagia Emeritus Professor Dr. Jomo K. Sundram to deliver his lecture. Dipersilakan, Prof.
Thank you very much, Professor Roslyn, and Assalamualaikum to all. This is a greeting in Arabic, as you all know, which basically means peace be upon you. And it's especially relevant in our times when you consider what's happening in Palestine, in Gaza, and specifically, but also the disquiet which exists in much of the world, including in our own region. At the regional level, we have various parties trying to start a war in the South China Sea, and we also have at the level of the nation a lot of unfortunate tensions and politicking, which prevents us from having a more nuanced understanding of the world. Allow me now to share with you my slideshow so that we can be on the same page, so to speak. And allow me to emphasize that what I'm going to do over the next few minutes is to, the first slide will basically be about an attempt to try to introduce, because I'm very aware that many of you are not trained in economics, just to familiarize yourself with the various issues which need to be understood so that we don't have confusion. So fiscal policy generally refers to the annual budgets. And remember that the budgets are basically both about revenue as well as about spending. And it's important to remember that the first 5-year plan in 1950, during the British colonial period, was essentially nothing more than a compilation of budgets anticipated for the next 5 years. And this was basically what we had. Now, since then, we have come a long way in 2 respects. First, we had greater and greater degree of planning greater degree of planning and greater degree of sophistication, a greater degree of ambition. And all this went on until the third Malaysia plan. I would argue that since the third Malaysia plan, planning has not been really taken very seriously in this country. And we have, to some extent, regressed to compilation of 5-year plans or what is anticipated. There are still some transformative elements, but those are increasingly modest. Now, it's also important to recognize that while most of our government revenue comes from taxes, anywhere between 20 to 30% might well come from earnings of government-owned assets. And this most famously would include Petronas, but there are also others to consider. Now, as far as spending is concerned, we have to recognize that a lot of government spending does not necessarily affect the economy in a very fundamental way because it involves servicing debt and past borrowings. And this is also very important. And there is a tendency in many economies to just keep borrowing because and to keep spending. So what has happened is that the fiscal deficit, the gap between spending and revenue, has been growing over time, and that is filled by debt or borrowings. Now, basically, what we have in the world is a situation where for about 3 or 4 decades after the Second World War, there was a tendency, especially influenced by Franklin Delano Roosevelt before the war, and for those who are trained in economics by John Maynard Keynes, of having so-called counter-cyclical fiscal policy. By and large, leaving things to the market basically results in pro-cyclical policies. So it's important to recognize the role of pro-cyclicality and the need for counter-cyclical policies, especially when you face an adverse situation. But one must also recognize that in Malaysia's case, we have a very open economy. We have an economy dominated by the private sector. So it's very difficult for government to have very effective counter-cyclical policies. But counter-cyclical policies have been attempted to varying degrees and have made a difference at various times when the economy has been in trouble. For example, within my own living memory, in 1974, the price of rubber collapsed badly. There were the demonstrations in Baling and Sik, and the government responded by various increases in government spending. Similarly, similar efforts were made in subsequent periods, and arguably most recently during the pandemic. Now, when we think about borrowing, there are 2 types of borrowing which can happen. You can borrow from within the economy, within the national economy, and that's often referred to as domestic borrowing, or you can borrow from abroad. Borrowing from abroad has other implications because you are borrowing foreign exchange. And borrowing foreign exchange basically means that you have to pay back in the currency in which you borrow. And this has important implications. So borrowing is not simply a question of borrowing from various sources available, but you're also borrowing foreign. When you're borrowing foreign exchange, the implications are much greater, and I would argue also very problematic. One thing which has happened very recently, there are many policies which can be undertaken, but one thing which has happened very recently in the last decade or decade and a half is something which the West initiated, because generally when you have a depressed situation, you're trying to get things going, and you usually use fiscal policy tools. But one thing the West did fairly recently was to resort to unconventional monetary policies, most famously what is called QE, or quantitative easing. And quantitative easing, of course, has been extremely important, but it meant that despite circumstances, the central banks of the US and Europe, especially, not Japan, resorted to keeping interest rates low. This situation, however, has changed as of slightly over 2 years ago, when US Fed Chair Powell raised interest rates. And the interest rates were raised very high. This created a lot of problems in developing countries in what is called the Global South, and this is a hugely problematic situation. Unfortunately, many developing countries have tied their own hands by having so-called independent central banks. And independent central banks basically are not really independent. They tend to respond to the powerful financial interests, domestic and foreign. And more recently, there have been attempts to set up so-called fiscal boards. In other words, even fiscal policy is being surrendered to so-called independent forces who actually represent powerful economic interests in particular countries. Now, one thing which happened in the last 2 years, which I think everybody should pay attention to, is something which I would refer to as monetary financing. Basically, the central banks of several countries, but most importantly for our purposes, Indonesia as well as the Philippines. In those two countries, what happened was that the central banks loaned to the finance ministries, loaned to the treasuries. And this enabled them to start spending without going to the markets. In other words, they didn't even go to the domestic bond market, and they certainly didn't go to the international markets. This is something quite unprecedented in recent times, and therefore worthy of note to suggest to you that we actually have more monetary policy space as well as fiscal policy space which governments can resort to, especially in constrained circumstances. Now, let me emphasize something which I think many people are reluctant to acknowledge. Our fiscal policy in the post-independence period can actually be described as neo-colonial to in various ways. If we think about colonial fiscal policy was very uneven, something which many people do not recognize. But I want to emphasize that in the Strait Settlements as well as Johor, which were the most directly controlled by the British, we find that in these two places, the collection of revenue mainly comprised so-called sin taxes. What are these sin taxes mainly from? 1, opium. 2, alcohol. 3, gambling. And 4, especially in the case of Johor, prostitution. So brothels actually paid to the government for the opportunity to run brothel to run brothels. So let's remember that these were things which were considered quite normal in the colonial period. Now, many of these things have changed in the post-colonial period. But I think it's very important for us to recognize that throughout this period, in the colonial period, taxation policies were very regressive. The most powerful corporate interests in the country, plantations, big mining houses, as well as so-called agency houses which controlled international trade, they were barely taxed. And instead, the tax burden fell not on working people directly, but largely on what we might call the petty businesses. So, for example, it is the working people who had to pay more for opium. Chinese working people who were using opium had to pay more for opium as a consequence of this situation. Now, in the FMS, in Federated Malaysia, it was slightly different, but I think it's important to remember. So what we have now is a system which is largely inherited from the colonial period, which was amended but not fundamentally transformed. And I think this is very important for us to remember. So if you think about the work of the late Professor Ismail Muhammad Saleh, was our colleague at UKM, Mael basically pointed out that in the post-colonial period, despite the innovation of introduction of income tax, which is a direct tax, basically the overall impact of taxation was regressive. In other words, income inequality after tax was even worse than before tax. And this situation he studied not only before the NEP, but also after the NEP. So his first year is 1968, 1970, 1973, and then later on he did another study for 1979. Okay, this, for those of you interested, you can see, look at these papers. So basically the point I'm trying to make is that in the early post-colonial period, taxation was regressive. How about government spending? I would argue that government spending was also regressive. In other words, we all live with the myth that taxation is like Robin Hood, taking from the rich and giving to the poor. That is a real myth. In fact, the converse is true. They don't take from the poor because the poor that do not pay much, cannot afford to pay much in taxes, but they really take from the middle. And this is, I think, important for us to recognize. So Jacob Meerman, who spent some time at UKM some decades ago, but he did a study from the 1970s where he studied government spending. And he too found that on the spending side, fiscal policy was regressive. Now, what about fiscal policy during the so-called Razak period? I refer to the 1970s as the Razak period. And of course, there was much expectations because of the declaration of the Rukun Negara, and very importantly, the new economic policy. The new economic policy was supposed to create the conditions for national unity by eradicating poverty, as well as by restructuring society. But the actual impact was actually continued the regressivity of, as I mentioned earlier, in referring to Professor Ismail's work. So the petroleum revenue windfall, which was a windfall revenue which became much more significant from the mid-1970s, was very important because it basically represents a windfall where you're taking more revenue. The government gets significantly more revenue in various ways, and but it does not fundamentally change the regressivity of both taxation as well as spending. But to some extent, there were efforts, particularly in eradicating poverty, which were slightly more progressive. And though that progressivity basically offset the regressivity, but the regressivity continued. Now, Ismail's work was not continued after he returned to Malaysia, except for the 1979 paper. But Professor Wee Chong Hui from UITM Sarawak did some work around the turn of the century, and her work has been published. And her work has got two parts. One is basically looking at the progressivity or otherwise of taxation in Malaysia. The other part refers to fiscal federalism, which of course is especially significant right now for those, especially for those thinking about Sabah and Sarawak. Now, the Najib reforms from 2009 basically raised indirect taxation. There was much more borrowing and so on. But I want to emphasize that before the Najib reforms, because we tend to focus on the Najib reforms from 2009, we have to refer to what Tun Daeng introduced with his first budget in 1984, which was the budget for 1985. And it was basically quite regressive. He basically reduced the progressivity of income tax and of direct taxation more generally, and created that was the first budget, and some of us commented on it at that time. Now, basically, I think it's also important to recognize that the Mahathir Lim Guat Eng replacement of GST with SST, there's very little, there are no studies that I know of on its direct impact, but I'm going to show you some data to suggest that it actually was quite not especially progressive. And as you all know, Tunku Zafrul, during his stint as finance minister under two prime ministers, refused to impose a windfall profit tax. So we've seen various governments over time refuse to do the obvious, namely to introduce a greater degree of progressivity in taxation. And this is especially pronounced for more than 4 decades since after the Razak years. Now, I mentioned earlier that Tun Daim introduced reforms from the 1984, and we find that that income tax, as I mentioned earlier, which was relatively more progressive, has become even less progressive, and wealth taxation was largely eliminated. There's still a little bit of wealth taxation, but it was largely eliminated by Tun Daim. So we find that since then, there has been a shift from direct taxation, which was significantly reduced from Tun Daim's reforms, to increasingly to indirect taxation on consumption. And so I don't want to get into the details about the goods tax, the sales tax, goods sales tax, and then the SST and so on and so forth. But there is very little evidence to suggest any of it was, but especially progressive. Now, I want to also emphasize that there has been a tendency to look at fiscal policy primarily in terms of the prevailing ideology of ethno-populism. And this was taken to a new level by Dato' Sri Najib, who significantly increased off-budget spending. Now, what is off-budget spending? Off-budget spending is basically borrowing to spend through government-linked companies or government-linked investment companies. So basically, for example, the most famous ones, which everybody knows about, is the creation of 1MDB and also the creation of ECRL. Okay, so these were basically borrowings which are off budget, and the significance of off budget is that you don't even have before the recent fiscal responsibility law, you didn't even need to report to Parliament. So even the Ketua Ketua Accountant Negara and the Ketua Audit Negara doesn't even report on these things, and the Public Accounts Committee in Parliament doesn't report on this. So this gives you a sense of the degree of autonomy of the off-budget spending and how the Prime Minister, especially Dato' Sri Najib, was able to abuse it. Now, I'm going to run over this quickly because I think it's important to recognize that many people are not fully aware of how Malaysia has changed over the last half century. From a primarily rural country, we are now a primarily urban country. For the Malay community in particular, most of Malays were self-employed in various different ways. Today, they comprise a significant share of the working class as well. So most Malays basically makan gaji also. So what does this mean? Basically, it means that the presence of arguably somewhere in the region of about 7 million foreign workers has a huge impact in terms of depressing incomes for everybody in the working class, especially at the lower end, and including Malays. Okay, so Tun Mahathir is famous for insisting we need to have a cheap labor policy in order to be internationally competitive, etc., etc. I won't get into all that, but this is important to remember. So in other words, the primary distribution of income is unequal because of these policies and our inability to come to terms. So the fact that more than two-thirds of the foreign workers in this country are undocumented, makes the situation even worse, because they work in conditions which basically are not subjected to any kind of labor law. And this so this means, for example, that almost the entire construction labor force, almost the entire agricultural labor force, almost in various other areas such as serving food and so on and so forth, you find that it is basically foreign workers who are working under very, very poor conditions. But we have young politicians, for example, bullying them, beating them up, and so on and so forth. And this, of course, doesn't speak well of our behavior as a nation, but it also has other implications. It also means that, at least at one time in the past, public health facilities were heavily used by them because there was no incentive for the employers of foreign labor to contribute revenue and this basically meant that health has been underfunded. It's an issue which I have a particular interest in, and I do hope that the government will seriously consider making a stronger commitment to health funding. But then there is another debate which Professor Garus Hasmi, for example, is quite familiar with, where we are talking about the funding of public health. Now, what are the schooling priorities which we have? I don't want to get into all that right now, but obviously it has become an issue of some concern, where internationally we are falling behind. Our PISA rankings are 3 years behind Vietnam, and we don't have to look at Singapore and things like that. We're 3 years behind Vietnam, and we have this huge improvement, supposedly in performance at the SPM level and so on and so forth. But I want to also emphasize that we have, as a nation, have not had a very strong sense of national purpose, and this is why initiatives such as Academy of Professor Malaysia become all the more important for us as we think about the future of our nation and how to really build a better Malaysia. Now, I'm just going to run through a few slides here, and basically the point I'm trying to make is that the minimum wage is really much more important than any other scheme for improving conditions for the worst off Malaysians. But don't forget that there are Malaysians who are working in conditions which are not subject to government surveillance, where they are earning even lower than this minimum wage. Some colleagues at ISIS, for example, went to do surveys before the pandemic and found that at the time when they were supposed to be earning at least 1,000, the Malaysian plantation workers were earning less. Of course, the foreign workers were earning even less. And the fact that we continue to allow this kind of abuse of foreign workers actually adversely affects Malaysian workers as well. Now, I won't get into the social protection debates, but I simply want to emphasize something which Tun Razak did in 1972 when he launched the SOCSO, the Social Security Organization, or PERCESO as it is now better known. But when he was launching that, he identified 9 different areas for social protection. Of course, it was not called social protection in those days, and those have largely been very little progress has been made since Tun Razak's time. So I would basically see much of the challenge in the country is partly to pay far more attention to many of the priorities which were suggested by Tun Razak, but which were never really pushed through, even during his administration, and certainly not since then. So let me just identify some of the areas which I think we need to, the government spending should be much more serious about without going into them. So child benefits, of course, employment programs, universal healthcare, food security, and of course, and nutrition, and also, of course, the new challenges of aging. Now, I also want to point out that developing countries actually do spend a bit on social protection, and the social protection component in fiscal stimulus in counter-cyclical spending has been quite significant in both developing countries and developed countries. Developing countries are only slightly behind developed countries in this respect. Now, the point really then becomes, how do we, it's really ultimately a question of political will. And I would emphasize that many of the things which I'm implicitly advocating are largely supported and endorsed by the international community, particularly the G77 caucus of developing countries in the United Nations system. So we need to do much, much more in terms of increasing the tax collection. We need to do much more in terms of improving the progressivity of the tax system. And unfortunately, there has been very little attention to both these issues for a long time. It became especially bad during this century. But so it's very important, therefore, to revive interest. You will find that there are very few fiscal economists in Malaysia. Go to any university and you will find very few people who do they will teach the course on fiscal economics with very little research to back it up, and not even using the references which I mentioned, and so on. So it's a real problem that we have a very superficial and simplistic understanding of fiscal issues in this country, and we really need to do far, far more to think about it. Now, let me also emphasize that the trend, especially in the last 3 decades or more, has been to introduce much, much more indirect taxation on consumption. And I would simply state here without actually going through to show you why it actually worsens inequality. So basically, roughly speaking, indirect taxation worsens inequality. Direct taxation generally can be potentially progressive, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's always progressive, especially if we do not. So people who in Malaysia and elsewhere who argue for flat income tax, one standard rate for everybody, they think they are being very innovative. They are actually regressive. They are basically, I would argue, fiscal dinosaurs. Now, the other thing to remember is that a lot of our national income data is actually misleading for a variety of reasons. So a lot of official statistics are misleading. For example, the undocumented foreign workers are not even reported in official data. So we pretend they are not here. And even as far as the census was concerned, for example, we ignore them. So, for example, when the government asked Richard Riot, I think he was the minister about 10 years ago, he asked for a survey of foreign workers. He found the people involved came up with an estimate of 6.7 million, and it turned out that 2.2 million was what the official number was. In other words, 4.5 million were not even captured by official statistics. Now, quickly, let me move on to emphasize that there is a lot of leakages due to what is now politely called trade mispricing. Previously, it was referred to as transfer pricing. And the other thing, of course, is downright tax evasion. It is facilitated in Malaysia by having so many different, by having more than one tax authority. But even having a single tax authority requires far more far more basically political will to collect taxes in a serious and consistent fashion. And some of you may still remember that a few years ago, the foreigners outside of the Americas who had accounts in Panama, Mossack Fonseca, the company, their list of clients was revealed. And outside of the Americas, Malaysia had the largest number of people who were basically using Panama as a tax dodge, okay, as a tax dodge and as an offshore haven. So this gives you a sense of how extensive and full of leakages the Malaysian tax system is. And there's a lot of interest in this, particularly in Africa, but we like to think we are so advanced that we don't need to pay attention to such problems. So there's also, of course, a need to reallocate government expenditure. And I just want to remind you that the data suggests that we are spending very little on the human priorities, but far, far more on military priorities. And this situation is going to worsen currently with two things which have been happening with the new Cold War, much more pressure for military spending, and with what is called fiscal austerity, much less spending in order to improve your credit ratings and so on and so forth. So all this basically means that you have less spending for social and progressive purposes. So I mentioned earlier that basically what happened, I just want to show you two tables which give you an idea. You know, many people think, oh, Najib's reforms introducing GST was very successful because you had, what is it called? Bantuan Sara Hidup. No, that was the second one. I can't remember Bantuan Satu MDB or something like that. Anyway, the point is basically taxes, additional taxes were collected, as this table indicates. But as far as transfers to households are concerned, in fact, by dropping all the earlier subsidies, basically households were worse off. Okay, so you have a significant reduction in what households got, but it was politically popular because you put cash in the hands of poor households. So it was the previous system of subsidizing food, etc., was abandoned in favor of this. So it was basically what you would call a populist thing, but because it is endorsed by the World Bank, nobody calls it populist. Okay, but I think we should get away from these simplistic slogans introduced by the bank to think much more seriously about these issues. So what have we been talking about recently? Last year, the government introduced the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which had one good element, which was basically to introduce parliamentary oversight of government guaranteed debt for government-linked companies. This is very important, especially after all the abuses of 1MDB, ECRL, even Dana Infra, and so on and so forth. And the Public Accounts Committee will basically have greater oversight to some extent. But it depends on on how well the Public Accounts Committee works, and especially in a period when you do not have much bipartisan cooperation, this becomes extremely difficult. As far as the possibility of counter-cyclical needs, the government has not been especially bold in terms of doing much more counter-cyclically. And I think it's important to remember that there are now lobbies pushing for the revival of GST and also for SST. And Dr. Amjad Rabi and others have been weighing in on this debate. My own position is to recommend basically a modified slightly more progressive GST in the form of what I would call a VAT. But I think it's important to remember that the current focus on cutting subsidies and so-called price distortions is basically market conforming rather than transformative. And I think this is very important for us to think about because it limits the kind of discussion and debate we have. We also find that targeting the so-called deserving ignores the cost of targeting. It also ignores the errors of inclusion as well as errors of exclusion, type 1 and type 2 errors, which are very, very important all over the world, not just in Malaysia, but especially likely to be significant in Malaysia because of the abuses. So I remember Tan Sri Zeti once telling a story of how when the Bantuan Sara Hidup was introduced, how all these friends of hers in an elite club in Kuala Lumpur were basically checking how much they got for Bantuan Sara Hidup. Okay, so we often think that these subsidies are for the poor, and part of the reason is if you make it universal, of course, it overcomes this kind of a problem. But this kind of and once you make something universal, you get much more political support for it because nobody feels excluded. But when you do it this way, you have a lot of problems. I think we also have a huge problem in Malaysia, which is an intergenerational problem of the funding of pensions, because the funding of pensions has been greatly inadequate. And I think it's also important to think about the intergenerational burden sharing of borrowing very heavily for future generations to pay off, which was very, very important in the case of ECRL, and I would argue in the case of 1MDB as well. But there are many other instances as well, including Dana Harta and so on. So I think so in that respect, the Fiscal Responsibility Act was desirable, but it does not solve many of our other problems. So let me thank you for your patience and attention to this. I hope it was clear enough. I was trying to be, I was also conscious of time constraints since we have quite a number of, we have a couple of discussants whom I'm sure will enrich our discussion greatly. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum.
Thank you very much, Prof. Jomo. Very much adhering to the time given to you. Thank you very much. Prof. Jomo, among the things that I think that struck me most is the fact that we have progressive social policy, modest progressive social policies, health underfunded, and of course the Madani concept, not shared sense of national purpose. So these are the things that I know when I was listening, those are some of the things that struck me. So without further ado, let me now call upon our first discussant for today, Professor Dr. Ahsan Ali Ghulam Hassan. Let me now just read his biography, his CV. Professor Ahsan Ali Ghulam Hassan is a distinguished academic and expert in economic planning, growth and development, serving as a professor at UTM Azman Hashim International Business School since 2016. Before that, Prof. Hassan was with UEM, right, Prof?
Thank you.
With a PhD in development planning from the University of Liverpool and advanced degrees from the University of Malaya and University Kebangsaan Malaysia, his research focuses on macroeconomic indicators and policy, demographic, spatial assessment, rural and urban impact. He has held prominent roles such as Dean at University Utara Malaysia and Deputy Director at Malaysia's Economic Planning Unit. He serves on various national advisory councils and committees contributing to economic policy formulation. As a consultant, he has worked with international organizations like the UNDP, WHO, and the World Bank, influencing both national and global economic strategies. His extensive experience and contributions have established him as a key figure in the field of economic development. All right, so very, very impressive credentials. Now, may I now invite Prof. Ahsan to deliver his presentations. Silakan, Prof.
Thank you, Prof. Roslin, my colleague, while I'm with UUM long time ago. Emeritus Professor Jomo, Emeritus Professor Prof. Jamal, Prof. Gairu, Professor, Tuan-Tuan, Puan-Puan. First of all, I will share my slide. Ladies and gentlemen, so I will try to link to what Prof. Jomo have discussed before and to the Malaysian economic progress. As we know that Malaysia is one of the middle income economy that going through rapid structural change from 1988 until 97, the average annual GDP rate around 9.4% per year. This was, however, offset by the late 1990s by the financial crisis in East and Southeast Asian countries. Then, after going through the difficult time of ASEAN financial crisis 97-98, Malaysia went through a series of economic crises after ASEAN financial crisis. The dot-com bubble and 9/11 crisis, global financial crisis starting with the US bubble economic, and finally COVID-19 and MCU. So what we can see that after ASEAN financial crisis, Malaysian GDP growth rate annual only about 4.8%. That is the new change, the challenge that Malaysia facing after the ASEAN financial crisis. Then I will talk also about the fiscal reform, since from 2006 until 2024, and rebuild fiscal buffer in the post-pandemic era. Ladies and gentlemen, Prof. Tuan-Tuan, about the foreign worker, fiscal reform about the foreign worker has been started since 9 Malaysian Plan. If we refer to 9 Malaysian Plan, it's mentioned clearly page 263. I will read. Selaras dengan dasar untuk beralih kepada aktiviti intensif teknologi dan nilai tambah yang tinggi, pengambilan pekerja asing akan dilaksanakan secara bijaksana. Bilangan pekerja asing akan dikurangkan secara beransur-ansur bagi menyediakan peluang pekerjaan yang lebih besar kepada kerja tempatan dan mengurangkan pengaliran keluar asing dan kos pentadbir. Tenaga buruh tempatan terutamanya di Sarawak perlu mengambil pemikiran dan tidak terlalu memilih pekerja. What I want to highlight here that the fiscal reform about the foreign worker not something emphasized since 9 Malaysian Plan. However, the issue until today, the numbers of foreign workers, as mentioned by Prof. Jomo as well just now, keep increasing. Then, under the next government, under Buku Harapan, also mentioned about the same thing. Buku Harapan membina negara memenuhi harta. Page 95, 98, as well as page 172. More focus on to decrease number of foreign workers, give more advantage to the local, especially to the young generation. And currently, under the current government, same fiscal reform about the foreign. As what mentioned by our Yang Amat Muhammad PM during speech tag Madani economy. This is based on Yang Amat Muhammad Perdana Menteri books, Madani, Economic Madani. So what I want to highlight here about the foreign worker fiscal reform, and maybe I can ask Professor Jonas, do we achieve the objective to reform about the foreign worker? Or what else we need to do? Yes, in whatever country, the foreign worker exists, but only for the 3D sector. But in Malaysia, everywhere, we can find the foreign worker. Next, about subsidy restructuring. Subsidy restructuring also not something new. Have been done since 4 June 2008. Government announced the petroleum subsidy restructuring policy. The difference only in terms of method. This restructuring subsidy, what I mean by 2008, the method more on rebate payment as well as road tax reduction. Then the current subsidy restructuring announced by our current Yang Amat Muhammad Perdana Menteri. Government also will come to another extra cash transfer program. That's what they call as a budi individu, the cash transfer program. As well as during Datuk Sri Najib era. When we introduced GST, then at the same time, we also introduced the cash transfer program. Right. So still about fiscal reform. Now I will talk about the tax restructuring. Just mentioned before this, the era after the ASEAN financial crisis. In that particular era, what happened to Malaysian economy, the gross movement have declined from about 9% to only about 4 to 5%. Second problem about our performance, lagging among the people, lagging among ASEAN countries. Then about cost of living keep increasing, as well as poverty and inequality need to be addressed. Then what policy that been done under Yang Amat Muhammad Najib? First, about the new economic model that involve One Malaysia Government Transformation Program, Economic Transformation Program, Rancangan Malaysia Initiative. Then the GST, Goods and Services Tax. About the GST, not something new. GST been discussed since 1983, implemented by Datuk Sri Najib since 1 April 2015. Why we propose GST? First, let's go back to the new economic model about the 3P, sustainability, including government revenue sustainability. This is because we depend too much on direct tax. We depend too much on direct tax. Direct tax means tax paid direct to the government. So what under GST, the indirect tax then will increase. Indirect tax means that we pay to the firm will pay to the government. That is indirect tax. Right? So under GST, that we expect the indirect tax will increase. That is number one. Number two, because we also depend from the petroleum income, about 32.6% our resources depend on petrol. Third, about underground economic or hidden economy in Malaysia, relatively about 20 to 30%. So we hope that under GST, the number of hidden economic also will decrease. This is another issue that I mentioned to you just now. We depend on petrol. However, the petroleum reserve keep decreasing. Based on this jawapan di Parlimen, untuk makluman ahli yang berhormat, berdasarkan kadar pengeluaran semasa sebanyak lebih kurang 6,000 tong sehari, reserve minyak dan gas Malaysia boleh bertahan lebih kurang 34 tahun kalau tak ada sumber baru, Prof. Ni bila ni? 2012. Yeah? So means that Malaysia need new resources, government new resources, sumber hasil yang baru. Baik, next. Next, when change the government, tukar kerajaan, then GST dihapuskan. 2018. Next, under the next government, new government, ada perbincangan untuk diadakan semula GST. But until now, masih belum jelas sama ada kita nak laksana GST atau tidak. But the four problem remain exist. Growth momentum has declined. Performance lagging behind beer. Cost of living keep increasing, especially after the pandemic. Poverty and equality remain to be addressed. Masalah yang sama juga. Still kita hadapi sekarang. Then, about rebuilding fiscal buffer for the post-pandemic era. It's about poverty and inequality. So what happened during the pandemic? And the unemployment rate increases during the pandemic. Okay? The unemployment rate increases. While the GDP growth negative. Then what happened to the absolute poverty? Absolute poverty increased to about 8.4%. So poverty increased to about 8.4%. We're facing the problem of poverty after the pandemic. Second, about saving. If we refer to the report by Department of Statistics, pendapatan perbelanjaan kemiskinan ketakseimbangan, in this report, explain about marginal propensity to consume. Professor, ladies and gentlemen, what happened to our MPC? The MPC increases from 6.6 to 9.6. It means that our marginal propensity to save decrease to only about berapa? Student economy. Decrease rapidly. MPC means that if the income increase about 100 ringgit, 66 ringgit people will use for consumption, the balance then for saving. Do you think that particular saving enough? Especially in the situation when we are toward aging population. We are toward aging population. Yeah? Do you think it's enough? That I want to ask Professor Joe. In this situation, what option that the government have? Either government can keep increasing tax, then use it for the social safety net program, decrease or restructuring a subsidy, or government involve more in GFC company to gain extra income. And then we need to 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 come. I mean, we need that I want to ask to Prof. Yomo. Prof. Yomo previously my professor where I'm doing Master of Economics at the University of Malaysia, 1992, 19. Prof. Right. Then I think that's all from my part, and I give back to Prof. Roslin. Thanks, Prof. Roslin.
Thank you very much, Prof. Hassan. A very insightful, notes points that you have raised. Among others, is foreign worker fiscal reform, subsidy restructuring, tax restructuring, and of course, the need for an alternative resources and new resources other than fuel. All right, without further ado, once again, I would like now to invite Professor Dr. Ghairul Zazmi to present his perspective. And before that, allow me to also introduce Prof. Dr. Ghairul Zazmi. Professor Dr. Ghairul Zazmi bin Madghani is a distinguished professor at IIUM's Gombak campus, where he also serves as the Dean of Kuliah of Economics and Management Sciences. His research spans a variety of topics, including sustainable development, Islamic finance, economic stability, poverty alleviation. Among his notable projects are the development of National SDG Roadmap, studies on Islamic microeconomics, and analysis of voting patterns in Malaysia. This is interesting. He has received national recognition as a fellow at Institute Masa Depan Malaysia. Prof. Ghairul Zazmi has an extensive publication record contributing to journals on topics ranging from sukuk markets to food price inflation and trade liberalization. He has also presented numerous conferences and authored several books and monographs on Islamic economics and socio-economic models. His ongoing research includes projects on entrepreneurship development and food waste minimization using behavioral economics. Without further ado, I now invite Prof. Ghairul. The floor is yours, Prof. Prof. Ghairul, over to
Yes,
you.
kejap.
Okay.
Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So I guess time to try to comment a little bit about the policy reforms about fiscal policies that we have in Malaysia. Okay, when we talk about fiscal policy, we have to look at two things. One is the revenue part, and the other one is on the expenditure part. Okay, so I think this one is one of the things that we have to look at in looking at the total revenue as a percentage of GDP for Malaysia. And if we look at this data, we'll be able to see that the total revenues that as a percentage of GDPs that the countries get have been going down. Okay? Government revenue as a proportion of GDP have been deteriorating from, if you look back in the 1990s, it's about 20-something%. Okay, but now it's going down to less than 20%. So the amount of incomes that the countries gets is going down. Okay, one of the things that we have to look at is why is it that it has been going down. Okay, we know for sure that GDP GDP growth have been decreasing. Okay, but even though the growth is decreasing, but GDP itself is increasing. Okay, but the increase in revenue is much less than the increase in much less than the increase in GDP. So you have this ratio that is going down. Okay, and if we look at across the globe, in terms of revenue per GDP, Malaysia is at the lower ends of revenue over GDP. So in 2023, it is only about 16%. Yeah. So you have, if you compare to 1990s, where it is about 20-something%, is a reduction of okay, you have the 10% reductions. Yeah. Imagine that this is the same thing. And if you look at these are the countries looking at government revenue as a percentage of GDP, we are somewhere, okay, we are somewhere at the end. Okay, so imagine that our GDP in 2022 is about 1.79 trillion, I guess. Okay, 179,135 million over there. 1% of that is about 17.9 million. If let's say we are able to increase our GDP ratio just by 2-3%, then it is about a revenue of about 50 billion. If let's say we can go back to what we have in 1990s, then the amount is going to be much more. Okay, so one of the things that we have to look at is why is it that the revenue have been going down. Okay, whereas some time ago it is on the high side. Okay, so since I think some of the listeners over here may not be from and have a background in economics. Yes, when we talk about revenue, that coming from tax, we have the direct tax and indirect tax. What is direct tax? I think the two speakers have been talking about the direct tax and indirect tax. So direct tax, okay, so you have income tax and real property tax. So that's some of the examples. So these are tax that are levied on a person directly. Okay, where indirect tax, so these are the GST and all the stuff. Okay, and for direct tax in Malaysia, it is under LHDN, and for the indirect tax, it is under the Custom Department. And normally, if we are talking about indirect tax and have been talked before, indirect tax usually it is more regressive. Okay, so in terms of the tax that the Malaysian government receives, so we can divide the tax into direct tax, indirect tax, and non-revenue tax. So if you go through the years, if you look at the graph over here, yeah, a large percentage of the tax come from indirect tax, come from direct tax, lesser from indirect tax, but more of you have a large percentage from non-tax revenue. Okay, so but more importantly, if you look at over here, where does the tax come from? As being said by Prof. Hassan, okay? If we look at our revenue, a lot of it come from petroleum. So that's why years ago, starting during the time of our Prime Minister Tun Abdullah Ahmad Badawi, they try to increase the different sources of revenue. So that's why people are talking about GST. Okay, but until now, you are talking about the amount of revenue that we get from petroleum is still very, very high. Okay? Even though it has been reducing. Okay? So we need to have much more varieties in terms of the sources of revenues that we have. So that's why I guess the GSTs will try to be introduced. Okay? So that we'll get more varieties in terms of our sources of revenue. Okay, so we have two issues. One is our ratios of revenue per GDP have been going down, okay? And another one is a large chunk of the revenues come from petroleum. So two very big issues that we need to try to solve. Okay, so this is the tables that come from our budget. Okay, looking at what are the sources of incomes that we have. Okay, so we have the direct tax. Okay, we have the percentage of direct tax, which is about 50-something%. Okay, and it expected in 2024 is going to be 60%. Okay, so these are the tax. The CITA is companies tax. PITA is petroleum income tax. You look at petroleum income tax, they're expecting that 7% of the revenue is going to come from petroleum. Okay, but then at the bottom, we also have sources from petroleum, and we talk about investment income that come from Petronas. Individual tax, direct tax, this is more like this is the income tax, where you have something, the income tax Malaysia in a way kind of like progressive, but we can do more of it. So it is about 13%, and then you have the indirect tax, which is much lower if you compare to direct tax. So SST expected is only 11% for 2024, and even if you look at 2023, it's also about 11%. Then other than that, we have excise duties, import duty, and export duty. Okay, and if you look down over here, investment income, okay, a large chunk of that investment income come from Petronas. Okay, so it's expected over here 39 million is going to come from investment income, but I think the majority of it come from Petronas, and a little bit of it come from Bank Negara and some other companies. Okay, so this is the sources of revenues that we have for Malaysia. The thing is that the revenue that we are getting is relatively it is going down. Okay, and we are depending on petroleum. So this is another graph that shows from 2009 okay, what do we have, and then now 2024, it is expected that only 15.6% of GDP is going to be government revenue. Previously in 2009 it is 22.3%. Okay, and what does the government do with the incomes that they have? Okay, if you look from 2021, in 2021, subsidies and social assistance is 23 billion over there. Okay, but then in 2022 it go up to 60 billion. Okay, a large chunk of it is for petroleum subsidy. So that's why that's why government is looking at how do we how to reduce this petroleum subsidy. What if rather than giving subsidies to petroleum, we can divert it to health, divert it to education? I think with that one, that is much better, okay, rather than giving it to people who drive big cars. I think we have a studies by UNICEF when they ask the urban poor, okay, whether they care about these petroleum subsidies. Okay? Most of them don't even care about the petroleum subsidies because they don't even own cars. They are not using cars. So it's the rich who are the one that are using cars that are benefited from petroleum subsidies. So we need to rethink how to change how to reallocate the expenditures, our expenditure, given that the revenues that we have is also decreasing. Okay, and then we go to what happened in 2010. Okay, so in 2010, the amount of subsidies you're talking about in terms of percentage of totals, it is 15%, 19%, 21%. So in a way, it is similar to let's say over here. If we look at here, subsidies and social assistance in terms of percentage, 10, 20, and 20%. Okay, so it's not much difference compared to what we have in 2010. Okay, the issue now, because of the amount of revenues that we get that is decreasing relatively, if most of the revenue, the expenditure, almost 100% goes to operating, and for development we have to we have to borrow. Okay? For development expenditure, we have to borrow, and because of that, we have the fiscal deficit. Okay, so imagine again back to, if let's say we can increase our revenue to GDP ratio, okay, by 2-3%. Okay, if we are able to increase that, then we do not have to borrow for the development expenditure for this year. Okay, so again, this is the government revenue and operating expenditure. Then we'll be able to see over there, okay, the amount of revenues, okay, and the operating expenditure is almost the same. So for development expenditure we have to borrow. And what are the factors that goes for development expenditure? Okay, so even though if we see over here, okay, so we have transport that is very big. Okay, health, even though we see over here is 5.1, but this is government. This is percentage of development expenditure. So if we go to health, then the total expenditure for health relative to GDP is still very low, still about 2%. Okay, and we have to improve on that. We have to improve on that ratio so that our health system is going to be a good health system. Okay, so now the question is, if we have this decreasing revenue to GDP ratio, so what can we do? Okay, one of the things that we can do is looking at the tax incentive that we give to attract investment. Okay, so you have studies by World Bank suggest that 80% of firms would have invested without that incentive. So why is there a need for incentive if the firm will come? Okay, why is it that we have to provide that incentive? So we not providing the incentive, we'll have we may be able to increase the revenues that we collect. Okay, so another things that we have to look at when we talk about fiscal policy. Okay, we can also think about development finance. Okay, okay, in trying to develop Malaysia to be a more sustainable economy. So we have a lot of different resources to finance development in Malaysia. Okay, rather in addition to the public funds, we have a lot. We do have private funds. Okay, that is a national private funds. We can have international public fund. We also have international private funds that can help to develop Malaysia, that can finance development initiative in Malaysia. Okay, so it's not just looking at the public fund. Okay, and since from IUM, okay, we have a lot of discussion. People are asking what is Islamic fiscal policy. It's not easy to answer, okay, because you are talking about borrowing, okay, with all this Islamic financial system. In a way, it is similar. So rather than borrowing from the using bond, now they are using sukuk. So in that case, that's not much different. Okay, but people have been talking about zakat, and zakat have been used for financing. It's not financing development, okay, for providing public goods previously. But even if we look at zakat, okay, the amount of zakat that's collected in 2020 is only about 3 billion. It's not much, okay, if you compare to the amounts of expenditures that we have in Malaysia. Okay, and basically this I'm just trying to show. Okay, these are all different ways, current ways that other countries have done to finance their development. Okay, so with that, thank you. So the issue now is when we look at Malaysia's fiscal policy, one is the revenue per GDP is going down, have been going down, trending downward for a long time. So we need to be able to move back to what was before in the 1990s. So another thing in terms of revenue, we are depending a lot on petroleum for our revenue. So because of that, we need to diversify our sources of revenue. So in terms of expenditure, so currently, if we look at the subsidies, some of the expenditure need to be reallocated to something that is more productive, something that will help the people more, rather than helping the rich. If we talk about the petroleum subsidy, which is very very big. Okay, with that, thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi.
All right, thank you very much, Prof. Gairu. I like the fact that you're sharing the data with us and doing some analysis. There's a request from the participant one of the participants for you to share the very last slide once again.
Okay,
before we go to the next session. Maybe the participant who has requested for the last slide and capture that.
We can provide the slides. So this is the works that we have done with UNDP, in terms of development financing for Malaysia. So what are the different type of financing that we can have in financing the development?
Okay, Dr. Foon, you can contact the Secretariat to perhaps request for the slides from Dr. Gairu. All right, thank you very much, Prof. Dr. Gairu. Again, for deciphering issues on the revenue over GDP, and the increase in GDP is less than proportionate than an increase in the GDP revenue versus GDP is less than 20% as compared to 20% before. Now, I would like to invite Yang Berbahagia Emeritus Professor Dr. Jomo to respond to the points highlighted by our discussants. And if Prof. Hassan, if I may highlight, one of the issues that you raised was the fact that the MPC, right, and MPS. All right, perhaps, Prof. Jomo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Roslin, and thank you very much to Prof. Hassan, and as well as Professor Garus Azmi for those remarks. They are very useful, and I hope they were as useful to the audience as well as it was to me. Basically, I think Professor Garus Azmi's comments greatly illustrate and elaborate on many of the points I was making. So I don't really feel a tremendous need to respond to any of the remarks he made, except to emphasize the two earlier slides he made, which is that the two earlier slides were, one, emphasizing how that Malaysia actually collects relatively little tax and gets very little revenue compared to most other countries. That, I think, was a very important point. But the other point was even more telling, and that is that the revenue collection by the Malaysian government has declined steadily over the decades. And it basically underscores the basic thrust of my argument. And it forces us all to think very seriously about why this is so. What is it about the Malaysian government which causes the Malaysian government to collect less and less tax over time? And the other point he made later on in the presentation was that many of the giveaways we give, the so-called incentives, are really quite unnecessary. Nobody really wants them, but they're given away. And I would simply make a point that, this is part of the neo-colonial policies which we have, the neocolonial tax system which we have. We favor foreign investors. We give them all kinds of breaks. We give them all kinds of, we call them politely, we call them incentives, except that they don't incentivize very much. And this, I think, is part of the problem we have. So this brings us to the question which Professor Hassan raises. And the key question which I think Professor Hassan raises is, what do we do in this situation? Okay? And I would simply emphasize that this depletion of fiscal buffers, which he mentions, is something which is deliberate. It's not accidental. It's deliberate. And it's a result, and it has been going on, I would argue, since the 1980s. And so what do we say about that? I personally think that it is time for a reversal. When Tun Dain introduced his reforms in 1984, we are now living 40 years thereafter. That decline, which Professor Gadus Azmi illustrated so well, has basically continued. But it doesn't have to be the case. There's absolutely no reason why there's any compulsion. Why do you have to reduce direct taxation? Why do you have to reduce the direct taxation rates, income tax rates? Why do you have to eliminate wealth taxes or virtually eliminate them, and so on? These are not accidental. They are not compelled by the situation we are in. These are choices. These are policy choices which have been made. And this has, I need to emphasize that all the rhetoric in the world has not contradicted this. And Professor Gadus Azmi illustrates this extremely well with his bar charts and so on. So I think the key question for us to think about is that if we are serious about changing the course of fiscal policy in this country, we have to be serious about being bold, about being willing to consider things and to re-examine a lot of the assumptions. This is very key. You know, if we continue to believe that, you know, there was a man about 40 years ago, 45 years ago, his name is Arthur Laffer. He's still alive, professor at Chicago. And Arthur Laffer came up with a so-called Laffer curve. And the Laffer curve claimed that if you tax less, there'll be more investments. Okay, and that was the basic argument of the Laffer curve. And is there any empirical support for it? No. The chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under Ronald Reagan, okay, not a radical by any means. The chairman of the council stepped down as chairman of the council and later became the president of the National Bureau of Economic Research while being a professor at Harvard. And he showed very definitively that the belief that it was that if you reduce taxation, you would basically have increased investment was a false belief. There is no empirical basis for it. This is Arthur Laffer arguing in the context of the US. Is there evidence elsewhere in the world that the Laffer curve might be true elsewhere in the world? No. Now, Donald Trump, when he was president, invoked Arthur Laffer again to justify his tax cuts. And again, there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever. So these are articles of faith. These are statements of faith of people who believe these things. The evidence is not there, but they believe it. Now, if we have people who do not do the work, the work which, for example, which was done by the discussants to actually look at the facts, then you're going to have a lot of policy based on articles of faith, on false advice, whether it's from the from some economists at the International Monetary Fund or some economists at the World Bank and so on and so forth. That is the problem which we have had. Now, under the last World Bank head who was here, he was a man who was not an economist. I would argue, thankfully, his field was public health. Some of you might remember him. His name was Firas Rahat. He was a prince in the Iraqi dynasty which disappeared. Okay? And Firas Rahat basically advised, I requested that he be asked to make a presentation. He made a presentation to the National Economic Action Council, well, which was distinguished by lack of action. But nonetheless, we had the National Economic Action Council advising and showing precisely what we have been discussing today, and the National Economic Action Council didn't do anything about it. Okay, absolutely nothing. So that let us not believe for one moment that these policies are natural. They are dictated by theory. They are dictated by received wisdom. That they are political choices, and often they are ideological choices as well. So we have to be very serious if we want to transform Malaysia's economy in a progressive direction through appropriate interventions, not just by spending, but through appropriate interventions. We need to ensure far more fiscal efficiency, much better collection of taxes, much more progressive collection of taxes, much more progressive spending. And these are the major challenges today. And I'm very appreciative to the discussants and especially Professor Khairul Sazmi for those very useful and illustrative graphs which he has presented to us. But I'm especially interested in hearing what other people have to say. I think it'd be useful for us to debate many of these issues, because only through debate are we going to make progress. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Prof. Jomo, for responding to the perspectives or to the presentations made by our two discussants. May I now invite participants to perhaps you can ask questions and make it as interactive as possible. We have about 15 more minutes. And I remember I was reminded right at the very beginning by Prof. Jomo, let make it light and relaxed. So I think, ladies and gentlemen, feel free to ask questions. And you can also ask the questions to the chat box. And Naima, you can just, send the questions to me. All right. Thank you very much. Okay. Any feedback, any comments? Any participants would like to highlight some issues or respond to the issues that have been brought, issues that have been presented by Prof. Jomo and our two discussants? Anyone? Is Prof. Chin here? Prof. Chin, can we have your thoughts on this? Are you here with us? Anyone?
Yeah, I think let me just add to the comment from Prof. Jomo.
Okay.
Yeah, because when we talk about that tax incentive, so we have the evidence where the firms say that they come here not because of the tax. Okay, but we are still providing the incentive, and the amount of the incentive is, I think, when the World Bank did the study, is about 10% of government revenue. So imagine, okay, what we have wasted, okay, just because of okay, we think that by providing the incentive that other companies going to come and invest in Malaysia. Okay, I think that there is a question with regard to I think from Dr. Bakri or something.
Okay.
Dr. Bakri is asking about the the reduction in tax. Okay, when it goes to the companies, okay, rather than goes to the government, right? Okay, he's asking whether it's better to go to the companies rather than going to the governments. Okay, so if we look at the chat, I think one of the things that we are looking at over here is one is the government need to have revenues for them to okay, for them to fund a lot of public goods that we have in the countries. Okay, so in a way, whether it is good to have that ratio going down, or yeah. So I think that is the question. If we compare to a lot of developed countries, the ratio is, I think, almost about 30%. Okay, so with that amount of revenues, there are a lot more things that we can do for the countries with regard to public goods, assuming that the governments are using the money efficiently lah. Okay, the government are using the money optimally. So if, let's say, the government are not using the money optimally, then maybe it's much better for the ratio to go down. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, Pak Garu, I also, I thought it was interesting when you
Yeah.
pointed out that the petroleum subsidies were actually, helping the rich rather than, those who should be benefiting from it, So I thought, that's something that has not brought to at least my attention, So maybe choosing and being more selective in terms of subsidies, as what Prof. Jombo has mentioned.
The recent study by UNICEF, when they interview people, urban poor in KL, and they ask these questions, whether it is good to remove the subsidy for them. Basically, they say, I don't care. I'm not using cars, so that's the answer.
There's something, yeah. Okay, there's another question to Prof. Jomo and our esteemed discussions today. Is it timely to reintroduce GST? Maybe Prof. Jomo, would you like to respond to this first? Before we go to Prof. Hassan. Prof. Jomo, you're muted.
So sorry. The pandemic ended and the age of Zoom almost ended. I've forgotten how to use Zoom. But I think basically what we have, by the way, there is a question from Dr. Amjad Rabi, whom I mentioned earlier, who has been involved in this debate, but he raised his hand. And but let me make the point that I'm not very keen on the GST. GST basically did three things which most people don't even talk about. One, we basically have a very, we now have, by giving the authority for GST to the customs, there's absolutely no reason why you need to have this bifurcation of tax authority. And in fact, if you had a single tax authority for the whole country, that tax authority could integrate information to minimize avoidance. For example, if companies are declaring something on their for GST purposes, and they are declaring something else for corporate tax purposes, you can basically catch that kind of discrepancy. You can minimize avoidance, and companies themselves, knowing that the tax authority has comprehensive information, will be reluctant and more careful about trying to do that. So having a single tax authority is basically a relatively desirable thing in the present circumstances. Now, why the second problem, I think, with introducing GST is that, well, it's not only a problem, it is a benefit in the sense that you consolidated different types of consumption taxes. Okay, the goods tax, the services tax, and so on and so forth. But basically, you did so in a way where you did enhance revenue, as I tried to illustrate earlier, But that enhancement of revenue is certainly quite regressive, because as we know, middle income people generally spend more on goods and services than high income people. So they would basically bear the brunt of GST. And even poor people will also pay GST. Poor people who are exempt from direct taxation because they do not qualify either on income criteria or a wealth criteria, they would avoid, but now they would have to be, they would pay. So it is basically a regressive tax. Now, all consumption taxes tend to be regressive, but the GST is especially regressive, and there are proposals to try to make it more progressive. And I do think that some of the proposals are serious, and this can be done. But there was another problem which is not often mentioned, is that the GST system was not working, and it was so unpopular because it jammed up the entire operations of businesses. Businesses who paid money to the government in advance, often anticipating that there would be rebates. Those rebates never came, or they were delayed for all kinds of reasons. So you have a great deal of frustration that even people who wanted to comply with the law were frustrated by it. You cannot have a system which basically you promise something to the public, to the taxpayers, and then jam up the system. So that, and it was even alleged that the government was almost in a kais pagi makan pagi kind of situation, where they were basically using the revenue from the rebates, not really revenue. They were using that, abusing it. And I think it's very, very important that for any kind of government to function well, any kind of tax authority to function well, you really have to be seen not to be functioning efficiently and equitably. This is very important for legitimacy, for taxation. But we have another problem, which Professor Garus Asmi basically emphasized, that there is a tendency for foreigners, and even for Malaysian companies, to come in as foreigners. This is a problem which many countries face. You have people from India, for example, setting up companies in Mauritius, and coming back to India as foreign investors. You have the same thing happening in China, going to Hong Kong, going to Singapore, and coming back to China as foreign investors. Now, under President Xi, some of those abuses have been reduced. But I think one has to recognize that there is no incentive under the existing laws and existing agreements we have signed on to for Malaysian investors who are big enough to invest as Malaysian investors in the Malaysian economy. So most of the investments which are taking place are actually from the medium-sized and smaller investors. The bigger investors prefer to use their size and so on to either go abroad, and if they want to invest in Malaysia, they come back as foreigners and so on. That's the famous example, of course, is Grab. Grab started off as a Malaysian company. It enjoyed subsidies from the Malaysian government, and then it moved to Singapore. Singapore gave even more incentives, but they taxed them less, and so they love to be in Singapore. And it sends a signal to everybody else. Why should anybody be a Malaysian investor if you're big, if you can afford not to be? So this is a very perverse kind of system. It's a very perverse kind of system, and we really need to think about it. So I think this is the kind of discussion which we need to have, and to try to change the discussion to ensure that there will be much more progressive reforms, including reforms of a fiscal variety. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Jomo. In the interest of time, I would like to maybe switch the, move to the next question, which I'm going to request, perhaps invite Prof. Ahsan to answer. It is about subsidy rationalization in a way for the government to reduce expenditure and avoid leakages. However, impact of this implementation is seen as negative by most people. In Prof's view, does the government dare to take this step because of economic growth that is getting better, or is it because political will? Okay, quite a complex question, Prof. Hassan.
Thank you, Prof. And about the subsidy.
Yeah.
So
Is it because of the economic growth, wanting to pursue economic growth, or is it because of the political will?
first of all, subsidy government can reduce subsidy. In the same time, that policy will stimulate consumption.
Mm.
In that way, the income will increase and finally will decrease unemployment as well. So let's go back to either that particular product consider as barang perlu atau barang what I want to say, either barang keperluan or barang kehendak. Right? Either that particular goods or services can be considered as barang keperluan atau barang kehendak. For barang kehendak, that means that it's, for me, it's okay if government want to reduce the but for barang keperluan, government need to continue give subsidy, especially for those low income group.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Hassan. So again, we have quite, I think, about 5 questions here, but I can only afford to choose only one. Okay, can you, to anyone of the discussants and Prof. Jomo, can you comment on Piketty's global wealth surtax for Malaysia? As it is based on asset, not income, it is comparable to our zakat and thus should appeal to the Islamists. This one, I think Dr. Gairu is the best, Prof. Gairu is the best person to answer. And then perhaps, no, I think maybe, and of course, Prof. Jomo and Prof. Hassan can add in. Okay, over to you, Prof. Gairu.
Soalan yang mana tu?
Okay, can you comment on Piketty's global wealth surtax for Malaysia? For Malaysians?
Okay.
Yeah, as it is based on assets, not income. It is comparable to our zakat and thus should appeal to Muslims.
Yes, but
Your thoughts on this?
I think the thing is we have to look at
Tax on assets rather than income.
If we follow the level curve want to have a small amount as tax as possible. Okay, but here you are talking about tax on assets rather than
Tax on income.
Okay, if we look at zakat, the rate for zakat is only 2.5%, which is very small. Okay, so it goes back to what is the objective that we are trying to do, and what is going to be the rate if we are talking about the tax is going to be on asset. Okay? One of the things that we don't want is and similar to what all the business people are talking about. Okay, when you tag us, then it's not going to be easy for us to, and the cost is going to go up, and it's going to affect the price of the products. But the thing now is we have to look at what is going to be the detail of the tax. How are we going to tax? What's going to be the rate?
Okay, thank you. Maybe Prof. Hassan, anything you would like to add from Prof. Gairu's response? And then back to Prof. Jomo.
Nothing.
Nothing. Prof. Jomo, anything you would like to add?
Yes, if I may, just quickly try to respond to the chat question from Dr. Bakri Musa.
Okay.
First, he raises the question as to whether or not institutional inertia was a factor in terms of of difficulties of changing. Certainly, in the institutional inertia is always a factor in bringing about change. But I would say that Tun Mahathir's commitment to Mahathir's lack of interest in progressive redistribution and his commitment to ensuring to creating a Malay wealthy Malay community is also fundamental. And his view and his commitment to doing so by keeping wages down is something which I think is very important. Now, Tun Mahathir undoubtedly is, for me, quite nationalistic. But I think it's very important, and this relates to Dr. Bakri's second question. I'm not sure that planning by itself is socialistic. When companies plan, there's nothing socialistic about that, and we accept that all the time. The question is when governments plan, and basically libertarian right wing is opposed to anything with government intervention. So the presumption that when you have government intervention, it's socialistic, I think is a false thing to say. And even if you look at the communist at China, the Communist Party of China prevails over a government where the fastest growing sector is actually capitalist. It's not socialistic. So I think we have to get away from this kind of ideological presumption, but also to think about, do 5-year plans matter anymore? I think he raises a very, very important question. Do 5-year plans matter? Ever since Tun Mahathir took over as Prime Minister, within months, or maybe, over a year, it took him to dispense with the fourth Malaysia plan, which was the last act of Tun Hussein On. Tun Hussein On wanted his last legacy for Malaysia before stepping down as Prime Minister was to launch the fourth Malaysia plan. When Tun Mahathir after he launched the fifth Malaysia plan, in less than a year, he abandoned the fifth Malaysia plan. So planning has certainly changed a great deal over time. And it's also important. Some prime ministers, people like Tun Abdullah Badawi, took it quite seriously. Other prime ministers have never taken planning terribly seriously. But I think one needs to think, and he raises, Dr. Bakri raises the question, perhaps we should think about sectoral plans and with varying time periods. And I think that's very important to think about. When you think, for example, about the industrial master plan, and you think about the turn in the world, the US turn, for example, to industrial policy. Well, industrial policy has suddenly become a good word. For decades, it was a bad word. Now, what does that imply? Well, in my book, it's basically defensiveness on the Americans. Because if you look at Biden's industrial policy, it basically is preceded by Trump. So you have a certain kind of aggressive industrial policy rather than the developmental industrial policy, which many of us were advocating for decades without any success. But I think it is important also that we do not have whimsical industrial policy. For example, Tun Mahathir decided that heavy industries was the way to go, and then suddenly abandons it after about 5 years. So we cannot have that kind of industrial policy either. So I do feel that there is a need for an overall view of the things, but whether 5-year plans are the best way to do so, I'm as open and as agnostic as Dr. Bakri is. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a very intriguing, enriching discussion indeed. And this is also evidenced by the number of questions that have been posted at the chat. I wish we could continue, but time is not on our side. Thank you very much once again. And before that, can I just give maybe half minute or 1 minute for the last words from the three of you, Professor Jomo, Professor Gairu, and Professor. All right. Last words, and what actually, what are the crucial, elements, the most crucial elements that need to be addressed for perhaps reform? One point, short and sweet. Thank you. Maybe Prof. Jomo? No, Prof. Gairu is smiling, so maybe we can, invite Prof. Gairu. Okay, Prof. Gairu. 1 minute.
Prof. Jomo stop with the plan. He are talking about RMK. When we want to do planning, we have to do a real planning lah. Unlike what we are doing, what the Malaysians are doing suddenly if we get to our rancangan Malaysia. So we have to do a real planning that do study.
So rancangan yang perlu betul-betul rancangan.
Betul-betul rancangan.
Okay, Prof. Hassan, before I go to Prof. Jomo for the last words, Prof. Hassan, satu je, one critical element.
You, Prof. I agree with Prof. Gairu. If we want to make plan, then we need to follow the plan. As I give you an example about the foreign labor issue, has been since 9 Malaysian plan and announced by numbers of government, but till now I think we still not overcome the problem of the foreign worker. That's all, Prof.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so proper planning, walk the talk, and then over to you, Prof. Jomo.
Thanks, Prof. Roslyn. I just want to thank everybody for your comments. Unfortunately, I'm not able to read everything. I saw Dr. Bakri's remarks, and I also know that Dr. Amjad had a question which he was unable to present. But I think this illustrates the importance of this topic, which Academy Professor Malaysia has picked up. I think what we do need is a public discussion, and I hope Academy Professor Malaysia will consider opening up the debates, because there were only a limited number of people who could participate directly in the debates. But I do think it's extremely important, and clearly there is a lot of, many people have a lot of things to say, and I would just encourage, the initiative of Professor Jamal, Prof. Roslyn, and others in ensuring this kind of discussion. And I'm very grateful to the discussants, of course, for their enriching comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Jomo. Yes, indeed, I think I totally agree. We need to do more, because I think this is a platform that we can actually, we call it from academic professors' perspective, merakyatkan ilmu. So we can actually do this more often, and we take note, Puan Naimah and the Secretariat. So, and Prof. Jamal too. So I think the last part is basically we would like to take photos, with all the participants. So may I request everyone, Prof. Chin is back here. May I request everyone to switch on the videos. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having all of you here in this session. Prof. Amjad is here, and everyone else is here. All right. Naimah, dah? Cik Fazli is here. Dr. Fuada, Dr. Hafiza, and the rest.
Okay, Prof. Okay.
Sudah. All right. So thank you very much once again to Prof. Jomo and our discussants, Prof. Gairu and Prof. Hassan, and to all participants, ladies and gentlemen. Have a productive day ahead. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Assalamualaikum.
Naimah, nanti we will issue e-certificates, right, for the participants.
Ya. Saya dah bagi link.
Oh, that would be nice. Okay, thank you very much all. Terima kasih,
Thank you, Prof.
Naimah. Okay.